Coming up in This Week in Computer Hardware, Intel's Core i9 benchmarked an AMD's EPYC new CPU. Does TCL have a $600 4K TV that's actually worth buying? Don't drop your Surface laptop, Vocal's Spark in-ear monitor, and more. It's all coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 420, recorded June 22nd, 2017. Intel's Core i9 benchmarked an AMD's EPYC new CPU. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, Twitch's weekly show that aims to bring you the most useful, most informative, most engaging, most delightful, and yes, most useful hardware news available anywhere on the interwebs. We talk about, well, of course, desktop PCs, gaming, laptops, mobile, and yes, even tablets. But today, it is all about Ryan Shrout getting pause on the Intel Core i9 7900X 10-core Skylake X processor review, which technically is faster than my Ryzen CPU, but cost how much more, sir? How much more did it cost?
Some dollars.
Some dollars.
Some dollars more. I don't know which Verizon CPU you have, actually, so I guess it's impossible for me to answer that question immediately.
I have an 1800X.
Okay, so it's double the price. Yours was MSRP $499. You probably paid a little bit less than that. This one launches at $999.
Huh.
So, you know, we've talked a lot about Skylake X and these processor launches. This is kind of like the first wave of them. They're going to come in multiple waves. This is the 10-core and below launch. So your 10, 8, 6, and 4-core parts that fit on this platform. The 4 cores that are Kaby Lake X parts. The 10, 8, and 6 are your Skylake X parts. Intel only sent us over the 10-core processor for this review. We have the 4-core Kaby Lake X we're doing stuff on as well. So we talked a lot about the specifications, right? The 7900X is the 10-core 20-thread replacement. It is how do I say this? Last year's flagship was the 6950X. It was a 10-core processor from Intel. This is the replacement in that segment at 10 cores. And if you go down to the second table, actually, that compares the 7900X to just the 6950X and the 7700K, you see a couple of interesting things that give you a clue as to what the performance is actually going to be like. One is you get 10 cores on the new part, 10 cores on the old part, and 4 cores on the Kaby Lake 7700K. So I picked these two comparisons because the Core i7 6950X was generally considered the top performer multi-threaded processor for a consumer. And the Core i7 7700K was generally considered the best single-threaded or lightly threaded processor that a consumer could buy. So if you look at these specs, you kind of see there's like a merging of them on the Core i9 7900X. So you get 10 cores still, but the base clock is, you know, a little bit higher than the last year's Enthusiast part. But if you look at the Turbo Boost 2, which is the clock speed of a maximum clock speed for all of the cores in single-threaded or lightly threaded applications, you see it's 4.3 gigahertz, which is within spitting distance, if you will, of the 7700K's speed. And if you look at what the X29 platform / Core i9 7900X has, something called Turbo Boost Max 3.0, which is the ability for it to pick specific cores on the die that can perform better and clock those a little bit higher, you get up to 4.5. So what you see is, if you look over at the 7700K and the 7900X clock speeds, they're within range of each other now, right? The base clocks are definitely significantly different, but I never really saw it go down to 3.3, even fully loaded for running like Blender rendering over the course of, you know, literally 10 to 12 minutes of full load. We saw those clock speeds hitting about 4 gigahertz on all 10 cores. It's quad channel DDR4 up to 2666 supported. Obviously, you can clock it higher if you have higher speed memory. 140 watt TDP. And then that last line is what's really important as well. Last year's 6950X got demolished in the media and from consumers because it launched at $1,700, and it was a drastic jump over what we had seen previous, like Extreme Edition flagship parts from Intel in the past. So even though $999 is still very expensive for a consumer CPU, it is worth noting that it is $700 less than the 10-core processor last year, while offering better performance pretty much across the board.
Well, this is good, right? Because we've had these minimal performance increases from Intel for the last couple generations on the desktop. Power, sort of power efficiency in terms of mobile has been a fantastic story. Overall performance has not been a great story if you are at the far end of the bell curve and need all the power. But obviously, A, Intel has shifted the price down, because B, they're also going to be going up to the Skylake X stuff with the 7980XE, which is going to be selling for $2,000. With that's their Threadripper competitor with the 18 cores, 36 threads.
Yeah, so they're definitely going to have more expensive options, but the way I'm looking at this is, the number of people that need more than 10 cores, honestly, the number of people that need 10 cores for stuff is fairly small. And as you go above that, it becomes even smaller. And what Intel has shown to do with this part is they're able to offer a CPU that has as good of single-threaded performance as the 7700K, while improving on the multi-threaded performance of the 6950X. So, last year they said that was the goal last year when they started introducing this idea of Turbo Boost Max technology, was to be able to make sure you had the option to have superior single-threaded performance without sacrificing, but you still had all of the cores and all of the threads necessary for the best multi-threading performance when those workloads were more necessary. And this is much closer to that capability than they were at last year, right? The single-threaded performance of the 6950X was its detriment last year. This year, the 7900X doesn't really have that. If you look at some of the performance results, like if you go to the page titled Media Encoding and Rendering, and you go down and just kind of look at Cinebench, for example, Cinebench R15 single-threaded, you'll see the single-threaded performance of the 7900X is, essentially identical to that of the 7700K, which was the highest processor in our testing up until this. And then if you look down at the multi-threaded performance result, it's got a solid 25% improvement. 15% improvement over the 6950X, right? So it is the new best multi-threaded processor. Now, a lot of questions about what AMD is going to do with Threadripper, and then if you want just massive amounts more, you could wait for up to Intel's 18-core part. But just as you look at the market today, they've done a very good job of creating an incredibly high-performance part for people that want to do that. There is one performance oddity that is worth discussing quickly, and that is on the 1080p gaming performance. You remember, probably not that long ago, we were talking a lot about the Ryzen processor and its 1080p gaming situation, if you want to call it that. As it turns out, there were some architectural changes in Skylake X that bring about a similar oddity. The architectural changes being they moved from a ring bus, which in a simple format is a bidirectional but linear communication method between all the cores, the caches, the memory controllers, PCI Express, whatever. They've moved over to a mesh interface, which lowers the average latency of memory, but it increases the maximum latency of memory, right? And for a very similar reason to what we saw with Ryzen, the L3 cache is slower on Skylake X than Broadwell E, which exhibits the behavior in 1080p gaming as slightly slower scores. Now, if you look at Civ 6 and Far Cry Primal, the differences are actually pretty big. But in general, it's just a couple of % slower than the 6950X, which is not that big of a deal, but it's worth noting. And also worth noting because the clock speed of the 7900X is significantly higher. So if we were to match the clock rates of these two processors, we would actually see that detriment extend down some for the 7900X, kind of as if we wanted to just prove out that, okay, this architecture is less efficient at this workload. You would do that. So, all the talk we had about the Ryzen stuff, and that, why was the 1080p gaming performance low? And then we eventually figured it out, and it was like, okay, what's AMD going to do about this? And they working with game developers on engine optimization. Intel's now kind of in the same boat.
Everything
because
old
of
is
this
new again.
re-architecture. Yeah. Now the delta is less, right? And I think in all, we tested 8 different games, and I think in all but one of them, and it was a very small difference, 126 versus 124 frames per second. In all but one of them, the Ryzen 7 1800X was slower or even with the 7900X. So the 7900X is a small step back from the 6950 for 1080p gaming, not higher res gaming, but 1080p gaming. But it's still able to kind of maintain its advantage over Ryzen in those instances, right? So take that for what you will.
I'm also
so that's like the performance oddity.
I'm just going to be obnoxious here and say, if you're spending $400, $600, $1,000 or more on a CPU, you really need to upgrade beyond the 1080p monitor. Just do yourself that favor.
100% with you. 100% with you. Yeah. I put that comment on the last page. It's like if there was a lot of discussion about people who buy $500 processors aren't doing 1080p gaming, and if you subscribe to that, then you definitely believe that people who are buying a $1,000 processor aren't doing 1080p gaming. So,
although there are a lot of people out there doing 1080p gaming. I was going to say the other thing is and due fairness, as much as I want to be like $1,000 processor, just to emphasize, as Ryan said, if AMD Ryzen didn't exist, I think the Core i9 7900X, if it was even released at all, would probably be a $1,500 or $1,800 part. And number two, for a comparable number of cores and threads, the Core i7 7820X is $100 more. Now, you could say that's, that's 25% more than the AMD Ryzen, but it's that to me is probably the most interesting. Like if I wanted to get another part in immediately, it wouldn't be Kaby Lake X. I kind of know what that's going to be performance wise. Sure. The 8-core versus 8-core battle is very interesting, right? So the $100 price delta is more manageable for people, and then you get into what can the Ryzen 7 1800X really do against the IPC improvements and that type of stuff. So this is actually a good reminder for me. I'm gonna bug Intel about getting in the 7820 and maybe just the 7800 as well, because that's $389, and that kind of goes up against the 1700X Ryzen part. So, but you're 100% right in that. I think these parts were going to be released anyway. This was on their roadmap. They probably brought it in a little bit, maybe a month or two early, trying to make sure that they would beat Threadripper to the punch and kind of get some extra momentum that way, even though their high core count parts aren't going to be till after. But the pricing definitely was adjusted, and Intel will tell you as much, right? If you talk to their marketing and their product managers and stuff behind closed doors, they don't want to go out and talk about it on their earnings call, but they'll say, yes, of course, this was a reaction to the reemergence of competition in this market. And I saw a lot of reviewers and a lot of commenters talking about this part, talking about that process as a negative, right? The only reason these priced this much is because they're reacting to AMD. And I'm like, maybe it's been so long that you don't remember, but that's expected. That's what you want to happen. You would have that's the whole
Intel
point of having competition.
Exactly. The Intel reacts, makes a part that's slightly better and slightly lower price, and then AMD does the same thing back again. And that's what we want. And you want to see that in the CPUs, you want to see that in the GPUs, right? That's why we want Vega to be successful and come out at the right price point with the right performance to really kind of move and cycle things forward. So I don't see this as a negative. I would caution people into buying these parts until we see Threadripper, right? Threadripper's not that far away, but it's a month plus, right? So if you can wait that long, then it might be worth seeing, because chances are there will be a Threadripper processor at $1,000 or less that has more cores. And how that performs, I don't know. We'll have to see what the clock speeds turn out to be. But it will be more interesting than just where it is now.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see that, because you look at like the Ryzen 7 1700X, the Ryzen 7 1800X, like on a handbrake test. You know, they're within 10 seconds of each other. The Core i9 7900X significantly faster than a Ryzen 7 1800X, in part because it has, you know, 2 more cores, 4 more threads, I would think. I don't know the maximum number of threads that handbrake will handle, but also because, you know, on a per core basis, I think the Core i9 7900X is definitely faster. So, you know, is it worth paying twice as much to be just under 30% faster on rendering? Not quite for me this week, but, you know, I'm with you. I think that sort of 8-core, 10-core battle later this summer is going to be, you know, it's going to be awesome for consumers and content creators that are looking to buy a new machine. This is exciting stuff.
I agree.
Exciting stuff.
I think a lot of people had negative feelings about this launch, regardless of what it was going to be, because, you know, you saw the flagship part was $2,000. We found out that those parts weren't going to be released until later. You know, kind of adding into the story that Intel was just scrambling to come up with some kind of thing. And $1,000 is still a lot of money, but I'm impressed that the single-threaded performance compared to the previous 10-core part went up as much as it did. Like, we're talking 25 to 35%. In our testing, and then multi-thread still gets a sizable boost. It does draw a lot of power. There's the 1080p gaming concern in there, so, you know, check out the full review that I wrote if you want to see all those details. But a better part launch than I had originally thought. So, yeah.
Something that showed up in email and kind of surprised me the other day. We had a question on Tech Thing this week, was where are the cheap mesh routers? And we talked about the fact that, you know, most of the mesh routers are using you know, one of the same parts from a particular family of Qualcomm processors, and the fact that, you know, when you're looking at wireless, most of the first generation wireless mesh systems, whether you're talking about Eero or Amplify or Google, you know, Wi-Fi or whatever it is, you're literally putting multiple wireless access points. So you need multiple processors. You know, you've got 3 boxes, and all 3 boxes require, you know, the processor, the radio, the antennas, the power supply. Oh, and by the way, all of the development to create the app for Android, for iOS, for configuration and setup. And I should mention right now, before I talk about this, is Eero is a sponsor at TWiCH. But Eero has just released their 2nd generation, or it's just announced and will be shipping soon, their 2nd generation products, the Eero Beacon, which is half the size of the Eero and plugs into any outlet. Which is supposed to have the same power and coverage as the 1st generation Eero, and then and has a nightlight built in, which I find highly amusing. Basically, it plugs into an outlet, very, very similar to Amplify's SD and HD. By the way, Amplify completely killed off the SD; they only do the HD now. And then there's a 2nd generation Eero, which is supposed to be twice as powerful, same shape and size as the original Eero. You know, does tri-band, 2 Ethernet ports. And all of these products, the Beacon and the 2nd generation Eero, are supposed to be backwards compatible with the 1st generation Eero. And I thought that was interesting, because I'm delighted and kind of surprised that Eero has iterated as fast as they have on these products. You know, but I think they're trying to sort of keep in the lead in terms of raw performance. Netgear's Orbi pretty much stomps everything. You know, the numbers I've seen and the testing that I've done. Because they have this basically a huge backplane, or, you know, backhaul they run between the wireless devices. But keep an eye out if you've been waiting for mesh to get less expensive. I don't think it's going to get much less expensive very fast, because if you think of a typical quality home router like a TP-Link C7, that's $90. And if you have a house under 2,000 square feet and you can put your router in the center of the house, that should be more than enough. You know, but if you're thinking about mesh networks and like, it's $400, it's $500, remember, you're essentially putting 3 wireless access points in your house. And that is not inexpensive. So just wanted to talk about that, because I think we're going to see a whole bunch of tweaks in this area. And it's also nice because, having tested a bunch of these devices from a bunch of different manufacturers, their software is all finally kind of settled down. And all of them are getting updated much faster and much more regularly than any or the vast majority of the consumer routers I've seen out there.
Right.
The lack of security updates and support for most consumer routers is shocking. So, in any case, it's interesting to look, because I certainly enjoy the coverage I get with the mesh routers that I've run in my house. And I'm also going to say, you know, if your current router gives you bad, you know, if your router isn't in the center of your house, you should move it to the center of your house. And yes, if you have multiple stories, if you have a lot of concrete walls, if you have horsehair, plaster, you're probably living in a Faraday cage, and that's when the mesh routing systems will make a big difference. So,
gotcha.
Just a thought there.
Yeah.
It has been playing on me. I was actually really surprised they iterated that fast. AMD EPYC 7000 series data center processor. Is AMD going after Xeon, like all of the Xeon platforms at this point?
So it's an interesting discussion, right? Because the answer to that is no. Not that they're not going after the platforms, but there's certain workloads that they are willing to admit that their platform won't be as good at, and
right.
They're totally fine with that. So the AMD EPYC, which is an awful brand name that caused me to have to sit through probably 10 to 15 different puns from different executives throughout the last week of briefings. Like, did you think that this was an EPYC launch? Things like that. This is AMD's kind of return. It's not kind of. This is their return to the server market, data center.
Right.
And people forget that, like, the Opteron brand was dominant in this field for a long time. Not like more than 50% market share, but for the size of the company, you're talking about 30, 35, 40% market share in some cases. And it totally fell off, right? I think it's probably been 6-8 years since there was an Opteron product release. Yeah, maybe. And so they basically have gone from a market share that rounds to zero, like 0 point something that rounds down. And AMD will tell you that. So the benefit they have with this, with a Zen architecture-based processor, is they can't lose, right? You literally will win market share by selling any number of systems into the ecosystem. And as it turns out, they not only can they just do that, they actually have a really good part that's really good at a whole lot of specific scenarios, right? So we've talked about it before. Their processors up to 32 cores, 8 channels of DDR4 memory, up to 2 terabytes of memory per socket, 128 PCIe lanes per processor, which is interesting when you get into the 2-core stuff, the 2-socket stuff, and their top SKU is a 32-core, 64-thread that has a maximum clock speed, max boost of 3.2 gigahertz. One of the things that AMD pushes on this is that they do not differentiate feature set by price point. So in the Xeon line, you lose some of the security features when you get down to level X or below. You lose memory channels when you get down to level X or below. All of the EPYC 7000 series processors are 8 channels of memory. All of them support 128 lanes of PCI Express. All of them have the same RAS capabilities, reliability, accessibility, storage capability, or security is that last one, capabilities. And they also have, so they only showed one specific benchmark, the SpecInt and SpecFP set, which is a very important metric for enterprise class computing. But that's the only one they really showed. So that gives you an idea that they're aware that there are performance weaknesses in some places. But for a socket to socket comparison, based on current pricing, Intel has a launch coming up later this summer as well for Xeon. The EPYC processors are like anywhere from 44 to 70% better at the same price point. Now, keep in mind that is with a core count improvement as well. Like the 7601, the EPYC 7601 is 32 cores. The Xeon, these part numbers are great. The Xeon E5 2699A V4 is a 22 core part. So you're talking about a 45% difference in core count. So that tells you where that performance delta really comes into play. But it's still a strong play in a market that needs competition and loves the idea of improved value and improved density. And they get improved density from 128. So 128 lanes of PCI Express exist on each CPU in this product line. When you have a 2-socket system, 64 lanes from each CPU are used for the socket-to-socket communication, meaning you get 64 lanes from each socket to for usable PCI Express, which again gets you back to the 128 lanes of usable PCI Express. 120 lanes is a lot. I saw a demo of 24 by 4 PCIe 3.0 NVMe SSDs in a single software RAID configuration, which is 76.2 terabytes of storage, running on 96 lanes of PCIe, running at 9.1 million IOPS and 53.3 gigabytes per second of throughput, or something like that, all in a one-socket CPU. And that's, it was a world record of IOPS for this benchmark for reads and writes. 53.3 gigabytes per second is a huge amount of bandwidth to do. And their comparison was, if you buy an Intel Xeon part, you only get 40 lanes of PCI Express as opposed to 128. Right? And that's a significant difference. Now, the number of use cases for that is small, but in the server world, much more prominent than you would ever see, like in a consumer market, right? So they did 24 NVMEs, and they still had 32 lanes of PCI Express left, or GPUs that you wanted to run compute capabilities on, or 100 gig Ethernet cards, or anything like that, right? 100 gigabit cards, 10 gig cards, whatever you wanted to add into that system. You still had 32 lanes of PCI Express left to do it. So there's a lot of flexibility in that configuration. So it launched formally this week, shipping today, or shipping. It started shipping this week. They had Dell and HPE and Microsoft for their Azure platform kind of up on stage. They've announced partnerships. They've got the right software industry and hardware industry guys on board. It's a pretty, and this is a significant deal for AMD, right? Because this is a profitable, higher margin area. And even though they will be, for the workloads where they're competitive, they're going to be priced lower than their competition, like price performance wise. And that's how they're going to take back market share. It's still going to be way more profitable than what you get out of Ryzen or Threadripper, just because of the audience that you're appealing to. So in terms of keeping the company afloat, keeping them financially stable, and able to continue to iterate and innovate on all areas, whether it be Radeon, Ryzen, or future EPYC lines, it's an important thing for them to have. Is this foothold in this space? Maybe in a year we're talking about them having 5% market share, but it's a huge market and a huge. And going from 0 to 5% is all positive, right? Maybe they'll be up at 10%. Right. We just kind of have to see how this pans out. But a pretty good launch and a pretty good collection of parts and partners that they were able to show off this week for it, despite the fact that the name is EPYC. But it's growing on me. I don't have any choice. They won't change it based on my suggestion, so we move forward.
Speaking of moving forward. Not quite as epic. 821180 Y-Gig tested with Asus Prime X29 Deluxe and Netgear Nighthawk X10. Cam wrote this up for PC Per. Call it Y-Gig, 8211AD. It's much like MU MIMO, multi-user MIMO. The idea is that this is going to be the super awesome future spec of Wi-Fi, and it's going to make everything cooler and more better. You might hear a certain something in my voice. There's been 8211AD routers out from Netgear and TP-Link. There's been very, very little actual ability to connect to these. You guys got in the Asus Prime X29 Deluxe motherboard that you use for your Skylake X review, which is a $500 motherboard. It is an expensive piece of it's an expensive piece of motherboard. It's an expensive motherboard, period. But it gave you a chance to play around with 8211AD and 8211AC on the same motherboard. And, as we like to do with all flavors of Wi-Fi, is to spout the ridiculous theoretical maximum, which is 4.6 gigabits per second. 4.6 gigabits per second. Ken hooked this up to the Netgear Nighthawk X10, and the Netgear has support for 10 gigabit networking, which is a pretty awesome concept. And Nighthawk X10 is also, a $500 router. It's a pretty high-end router. It's probably not something you're going to use in a home as a consumer. But when you look at the iPerf numbers, things are amazing, because you're essentially, that top blue line there is 2,200 megabits per second on 802.11ad versus 567 megabits per second on 802.11ac. So That's 2.2 gigabits per second over a wireless connection. It's also a wireless connection at 0 feet. At 2 feet away, 802.11ad drops to 1.8 gigabits per second. And at 15 feet away, i.e. across the room in a typical house or across part of the room in a typical office, you've dropped down to 1.7. Still phenomenally fast and way faster than 802.11ac, which is at 550 megabits per second at 15 feet. And then if you start getting some serious space, 35 feet, you've dropped down to 733 megabits per second for 802.11ad. And oddly enough, based in the testing environment you guys used, 802.11ac was up to 596 megabits per second. So 802.11ad, unbelievably fast, drops like a stone when as you get farther and farther away from it. You know, which is not entirely unexpected. So if you are in an organization where you are looking for faster than gigabit speeds, but do not want to go to the astronomical expense of 802.11, or I should say of 10 gigabit Ethernet, which is really expensive, you could consider 802.11ad if you can find the cards for it or the motherboard support for it. But you're going to have to deploy a wireless access point probably every 20 feet in your organization to take advantage of the performance. So I still feel like if you are at a place where you're moving huge files, you're probably, if you're going to spend the money, it seems like 10 gigabit Ethernet's probably a better buy at this point.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. You can buy a considerable amount of 10 gig equipment for the cost of the router itself. Like you could buy, what did we find, Ken, recently? 10 gig cards for like $100, $125 on eBay type of stuff now. Yeah, I mean they're coming down. Yeah, they're coming down, and the routers are still priced, you know, in the like 400 to 800 range, depending on, or the switches. I'm sorry, like the 4 range, and then, you know, the truth is that the wires suck, cables are awful. We put up with them because of how much of performance advantage we get with stuff. Ideally, we want everything to be wireless, whether it be, you know, data transfer or power or whatever. So if it were me and I were investing for this office again or my house, I would go what you're saying. I would do a 10 gig connection. And we've contemplated that and how we would implement that here several times. But assuming that, you know, we're very early in the 802.11ad thing, like we've already seen a couple of firmware updates for that Netgear router. You know, we assume we're going to see driver changes and updates on the controller side, not just for integrated on motherboards, but for anything. So, you know, maybe we'll see some improvements in that because, right, I mean, what did we hit? 2.2, well under the 4.6, but that's generally my experience with all wireless connectivity. It's still pretty impressive. I just, you know, also it's not going to pass through walls, right?
Yeah.
So it's very much line of sight. In our particular environment, it might work out better because we have this one big space with not a lot of stuff in the way most of the time. So you could probably make WiGig work, but like in a typical home with rooms and multi levels and all that stuff, it's
walls
not. Well, yeah, with these things called walls and whatnot. I mean, they can't get through windows, it turns out, you know. I mean, in reality, a couple of sheets of paper between the antenna will make a difference, right? You know, there's area to go around the paper and all that stuff. Yeah. And, I mean, it's you know, human bodies as bags of water walking in between the radios and stuff like that. There's a lot to think about.
Well, it's an interesting point. Like you said, ideally everything would be wireless, but there's a reason, you know, despite the fact that my Apple, my Roku, my Blu-ray player, oh goodness, and several other devices are all literally in the same closet with my router. Despite the fact that they are all in the same closet with my router, they are all wired with gigabit Ethernet because it doesn't go down, it doesn't have fluctuation issues, it doesn't have performance issues.
Yep.
You know, and I'm given that they are all locked in the same closet, I could do fine with 802.11n but you know, at this point, I run an Ethernet cable and I never think about it again. I'm also not trying to transfer, say, several gigabytes of files several times a day, or trying to work over, trying to, say, edit video off of a remote NAS or something. So there are definitely cases where I can totally see, if you're an organization that's tired of spending staggering amounts of money pulling fresh cable every several years for an Ethernet, where this would be really attractive. But you're also going to be, if you don't have a line of sight situation, you're going to be putting in a whole lot of routers or a whole lot of wireless access points to make this work. So close, yet so far. And the reality, it's funny because one of our patrons on Tech Thing was like, I don't understand why you're so down on, you say that you only get the throughput that the server gives you at the other end. Because I was talking about, I signed up for, I'm dropping Comcast, right? Because there's a new wireless internet ISP startup in my neighborhood. They're using all Ubiquiti gear right now. When I signed up for it, they were promising 50 megabit up, 50 megabit down for $50 a month. And I was like, it's half in theory, right? It's half the bandwidth I'm getting from Comcast, but how often do I hit anything other than a speed test? Do I get 100 megabits per second? I've never hit a server with that. I'm getting like 10 megabits typically off of Steam. So I'm like, all right, I'll try this 50 megabit. And then, of course, when they install it, by the time they install it 2 weeks later, their guarantee is now 75 to 100 megabits down. And I get 200 megabits the first week I've signed up for this new service with like 7 millisecond ping times. But I bring all that up is, unless you are doing huge file backups or moving tremendous amounts of data around constantly, you don't necessarily need, a massive network in your house. I mean, gigabit's kind of like great to have, and 802.11n is great to have, but it's like, or 802.11ac is great to have. Did I say 802.11n twice? My apologies. 802.11ac is great to have. 802.11n works a lot better with 802.11ac routers. 802.11n routers suck. Don't know where I went on that one, but it's I'm excited by the idea of more bandwidth, but you guys are moving around unbelievably large files because of the way you're testing GPUs. Video editing shops are moving around unbelievably huge amounts of data, but the average household, there's not going to be a huge advantage of being able to transfer 2 gigabytes of data or 2 megabits of data or 2,000 megabits of data per second, because they're not moving that many files that big. It's not going to help you streaming 4K Netflix. Unless you have, 150 people in your house streaming 4K Netflix simultaneously. But that's a whole different issue at that point.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Just I have one more, because I was curious now. The Asus just released a 10 gig PCIe x 4 card. It's $116 on Amazon. The XG-C100C 10G network adapter.
How much is that again?
$116.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those are like less than I think those are a quarter of what they cost, the first one, compared to the first one I saw a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe I have a 10 gig future in my house just because. iFixit, also a regular sponsor of This Week in Computer Hardware, gives the Microsoft Surface laptop a 0 on repairability, which is a polite way of saying don't drop your Surface laptop.
Yeah. Or have a really good extended warranty. I want to say like the iPad 3, you guys know, had like a 2, which is one of the lowest scores that anybody's ever seen on this. But this is there, and it's funny because I love reading the comments as you scroll down to step 2. Before we delve into presumably another repair nightmare, let's get to the lay of the land with some sweet X-rays. If you click on that picture on the right, you'll see the X-ray of the interior of what's going on, which I absolutely love. Yeah, I just think that's really cool how they do that. How much an X-ray machine costs?
I think they work with an organization called Creative Electron.
Okay.
And that would be creativeelectron.com.
Maybe if I just take all my electronics with me when I go to the airport and I can they let me walk behind a thing and take a picture as the X-ray goes through. Maybe it's probably gonna work.
Yeah, it's pretty well. Go to step 4, right? If you that was creative.
Yeah,
that's a pretty. I'll be spending some quality time in Creative Electron pre-owned X-ray systems. But if you take a look at I want to say around step 4, there it is. Under the feet, there's no screws, so they end up. The first thing I have to do is pry. Yeah, so there's no screws under the feet, so they get out the Jimmy tool, and oh my goodness, it's like 2 clicks over. You can see where they're literally having to tear the Elantra keyboard cover off to start getting access to the machine.
Nice.
So that's essentially a fabric cover that is permanently glued on. This is, oh goodness. Yeah, it's ultrasonic spot welds that they had to pop through to get the Elantra cover on. Ultrasonic welding is fantastic, but not something you can sort of repair at home. That's, yeah. Yeah, there's the connector for the keyboard is under a clip-on shield. It just gets uglier and uglier and uglier the deeper they get.
So for you, does this impact your decisions to buy these products? For you personally,
for me personally, because of my tendency to destroy screens on phones, I get very uptight about phones and tablets at this point that are enormously difficult to repair. I did an iPad 2 repair a couple of years ago, and it was one of, I mean, it is as somebody who's been trapped under a race vehicle with a cactus shoved way half up his posterior, a cactus, an actual, honest to God, we're in the desert spiky thing that was 10 inches off the ground. The only way to reach the bolts for the transmission we had to swap was to end up wedging my bottom parts against the cactus while I'm up, basically trying not to burn myself on an exhaust from a vehicle that's been running for 18 hours while getting covered with hot transmission fluid. I can honestly say doing the iPad screen repair a couple of years ago where I had to slowly melt the glue on the exterior with a heated tube and then put, picks under it to keep it from resettling down, that was actually worse, right? Being covered with hot oil in the desert while burning yourself with a cactus shoved into your posterior is less irritating than repairing a glued-on screen. So in that sense, yes, I do. I do pay attention to repairability scores. Most, laptops these days, whether you're talking about an XPS 13 or the Surface, are not lending themselves to repair. Upgrade, absolutely. And one of the things I love about Dell, who is not a sponsor, is the fact that they make it, if you can Google a little bit or use the search on their website, you can get the repair manuals for their laptops, which will walk you through some pretty deep, sophisticated, and potentially terrifying repairs, for a lot of their products, but, having carried a Surface around a bunch, it never particularly, I haven't been particularly scared carrying it around. I haven't been particularly nervous carrying it around. I may be a little more uptight carrying it around in the future, having seen, what it takes to get to it. But I have, knock on wood, laptop construction has gotten so much better in the last decade. The screens seem to be holding up a lot better. Now that I've said that, I'm on my way to VidCon later on today, so I'm sure I'll just score my laptop screen on the way down there. But, it's worth knowing that if not only do most laptops not lend themselves to upgrade, most laptops don't lend themselves to repair. And this laptop in particular is essentially, to do anything, you have to permanently tear off the keyboard cover. You can get in there, but you're also probably going to have to buy a second laptop to cannibalize for parts to repair the first laptop, which is not entirely unprecedented, but this is not meant to be opened. It is not meant to be repaired. Everything is soldered on. The headphone jack, should you manage to trash it, you have to remove the heatsink, the fan, the display, and the motherboard to get to it. And you effectively cannot replace the battery. So the lifespan of this laptop is going to be limited by the duration of a lithium-ion battery. And that part is where I get kind of frustrated, because I have worn out, 3 years of everyday use, and you're probably guaranteed to have a minimal life left on a lithium-ion battery.
Right.
So that, if you plan to use a laptop more than 3 years, you might be a little uptight about this. Or you'll say, at that point, I'll be able to buy a 40,000 milliamp hour, USB-C or USB laptop battery, and I can drag it around that way. But that's certainly your option. It's interesting to look at. It's an interesting question. I think the vast majority of the people who buy these never think twice about repairability. And probably the vast majority of the people who buy these don't break their screens. And again, I've managed to not break a screen in a really long time. So on phones,
knock on something quickly. Knock. There you go.
Yeah, I screen protection in a Magpul case has kept my latest iPhone 6 going. So, again, I'm going to knock on wood, lest my screen explodes somewhere between here and LA while I'm tootling down I-5. But, I think repairability is important. You may not, but it's, for me personally, in terms of like being able to repair the screen, extremely important on phones, not so important on laptops. Being able to replace the battery on laptops is kind of a big deal to me. So
yes, that's
I think
fair.
I may have gone a little too far on that. Focal, speaker manufacturer of the Utopia, which is one of the most extraordinary headphones ever made, which it should be because they sell it for like $4,000. It's a beryllium cone and this magnificent, the motor, or sort of the magnet and coil that moves the speaker in and out, is essentially has a big open space, which does a lot of amazing things for the performance of the speaker and the Focal Utopia. The Sopra speakers they came out with, Sopra number 3s. I got a chance to hear those not too long ago at a dealer. I got to spend some time down in Southern California. Amazing, $20,000. And they came out with the Spark this week, which is a little tiny 9.5 millimeter. It's got a 9.5 millimeter driver. You can see me dangling them right there. They come in white. They come in black, a little silver back. French styling. The ones on the left are Focal's first in-ear monitors, the Spear, which came out about a year and a half ago. And the one you're looking at right now is the Focal Spark. And the Spear sounded amazing. It was a little expensive when it came out. It was $180. It's now available. They're closing it out. They're bringing out in July the Spear S. So you can pick that original Spear up, which sounds amazing. A big, huge, really surprisingly huge sound for an in-ear monitor. That's the case that comes with the Focal Spark. But the Spark, the first song I played through it, I'm a big fan of Amber Rubarth, Songs of the 17th Ward. Beautiful, kind of folky, funky. She's a singer, songwriter. There's bass, there's percussion. And I realized, like, despite the fact that I'm listening to a cello, it's a very thuddy. There's a lot of impact to the bass on this little tiny earbud. And beautiful presence, a lot of detail, really surprising performance. And then I immediately went from like this beautiful female voice singer-songwriter, which is, a Chesky recording with this magnificent binaural recording, just flawless production, to Rage Against the Machine, because, hey, who better to rock out with? Yeah, and the word as I turned the volume up to get my rock on, it felt overmodulated, overdriven. Shannon's word for it is it seemed to be shrieking. And it seems like they use this 9.5 millimeter Mylar driver. And my concern is that if you drive it heavily, it does not sound good. Fantastic sort of for small chamber, quiet, folky, fun, relaxed listening. But as soon as you push it, with something, heavy duty or some heavy rock and roll, it started to sort of distort or fade out, not fade out, but distort. And so that was really disappointing. That said, the Spear S is coming out in July, and Focal makes a ton of amazing headphones. But I'll keep playing around with them. But I tried different sources. JDS Labs Element, which is a flawless DAC headphone amp that can pump out. I thought, maybe my phone just isn't sending a clean signal. It wasn't the phone. The source wasn't the problem. But really neat sounding headphone until it got pushed, and then it just started to sound overmodulated or distorted or broken up, which I was a little disappointed but we'll see. Maybe they'll clean up over time. But you know, if you're looking at them, not if you're going to play them real loud. If you're into the soft music, they deliver a phenomenal amount of detail for $69. But currently, my favorite in the price range is still
it's great.
Still the one more triple driver in-ear monitor, which is selling for under $100 right now. You got to spend a lot more money to get something that sounds a lot better than that. And most of the stuff that's cheap in earbuds sounds cheap in earbuds. TCL PSeries Roku. Kind of a television our friend Robert Heron's been waiting on. Pretty exciting. Roku got hands on one, or excuse me, The Verge got hands on the TCL P-Series. They're calling it the best budget 4K TV you can get. Really, really good deal. It's $600 for a 55-inch LCD flat panel. It's not going to give you all of the it's not going to give you the color range of a top-of-the-line television from LG or Samsung. It's not going to give you off-axis viewing that's as good as the high-end HD TVs, but it will give you HDR10, Dolby Vision, and a good color on a 55-inch screen for $600. That's a pretty big deal. The other thing is it looks like it's a particularly good television for gamers. Chris Welch, the reviewer at The Verge, noticed that its latency is some of the lowest he's actually seen on a 4K television. You know, pretty crazy. It's got 72 contrast control zones, which is essentially TCL's current version of full array local dimming, which is the idea that you can control the backlighting around multiple sections of the television. So if there's a bright door in the middle of a dark house at night, right? They can turn up the local dimming behind the door area, turn it off in the other areas, or turn it down in the other areas. AVS forum, Mr. Welch notes in the review that there seems to be some QA issues or quality assurance issues because the first round of these available exclusively on Amazon. Some ABS forum buyers have said they've received units with backlight bleed, uniformity issues, blooming, and other annoyances. And I'm going to quote The Verge on that one there. One, not everybody's seeing such problems, writes Mr. Welch, and some say they're basically unnotable when content is on the screen. And his television was flawless, but it was also handpicked and sent out by TCL. So they may have just grabbed it off the rack. They may have gone through 50 of them to find the perfect one to send out for review. But something to keep an eye out for. Probably sold out. Will be available on Best Buy later this year. And the 50 and 65-inch versions will be available in late 2017. Also got to say, something that Robert and I were talking to AVXL is the nice thing about Roku is it seems to be maintained, supported, treated well. Unlike so many of the operating systems we've seen announced for televisions in the last few years, the Roku stuff seems to keep going and not be abandoned by the television manufacturer in minutes. So,
right.
Good review up at The Verge. Definitely worth checking out.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, I agree. That looks pretty good.
Man,
it's a great price.
No, so we're still waiting on AMD's Threadripper. We're still waiting on pretty much all the Vega stuff.
Yep.
And do we have any more detail? Go ahead.
They basically said that RX Vega is going to be out at the end of July. They did interestingly show a couple of they have their professional series, which is called Radeon Instinct, which is their version that would go in servers and that type of stuff. They did reveal a couple of details on it, just in terms of it was going to have 12.3 teraflops of single precision performance, which you can try to make the analogy to that being the consumer level performance as well. It's tough to do, right? Because they've shown in the Radeon Instinct MI25, which is a Vega GPU architecture, 16 gigs of HBM2, a 300 watt TDP, so a very high TDP on that card. They've talked about the Radeon Frontier Edition, which has a 300 watt version and a 375 watt TDP version. Right. So we would assume that the 375 watt TDP version of Radeon Frontier Edition, that is Vega, is going to be higher than 12.3 teraflops. Yeah, there's a slide with the details on it. So you can maybe come up with some kind of guesstimate then on what the performance might be on the consumer part. Now, but they may decide that they can get the consumer part down to 250 watts and get relatively good performance depending on their pricing. But this gives you an idea then of where Vega is performing again, right? And if you compare that to the Radeon R9 Fury X, it was rated at 8.6 teraflops. So that's like a 40% increase over the Fury X, the highest end single performing GPU that they have so far. And it was a 275 watt TDP. So that would be a moderate improvement moderate increase in TDP for a pretty substantial performance increase. But again, it's risky to start to apply those potential performance levels to the consumer parts as well. But they've said they're going to launch it at SIGGRAPH, so that's the last 2 days of July and the first 2 days of August. So if we don't know more before then, we will know more on those, I think on July 30th or 31st or whatever. So maybe July 32nd, you just don't know.
It's funny because there were some price leaks for the Radeon Vega Frontier Edition, the air-cooled and the water-cooled version up on, I want to say, Sabre PC, where it looked like it was going to be $1,200 for an air-cooled Frontier Edition and $1,800 for the Radeon Vega liquid-cooled edition. Otherwise, the specs would be exactly the same. Is it pointless to speculate on that pricing? Just, stop asking questions, wait until the end of July like everybody else?
That pricing seems, again, I have no knowledge of this yet, but that seems reasonable based on the market that they're going after, right? The $2,000 price point for their flagship might work for, you're kind of somewhere in the middle of competing with the Titan XP and the Quadro line, right? Somewhere in that range. And like the Quadro P6000 is a $4,000 video card. So, they could, if they have performance that's close to that, they could, in theory, go up to that price point. I wouldn't, I don't think any gamers or enthusiasts should expect the pricing to be reasonable enough that you would want to buy one for your own part, even to say you have it a month early. That's something we're looking at doing because AMD has pretty much told us that they're not sampling this hardware out for review. But if this is going to be our first chance to get hands-on with the Radeon Vega architecture, we're going to do that. So buy one or find a buddy that's working somewhere where he has access to one, and make sure we get some testing done as soon as we can on it. So that's the goal. That's the goal. And then
someone who may be interested.
That's in 5 days.
Oh my goodness, 5 days. We wait, as always, with bated breath, ladies and gentlemen. PCPer.com. In case you didn't know, that's where you can find Mr. Ryan Shrout on a daily basis, running the benchmarks and making the mayhem that is the hardware reviewing. You can find me over at techthing.com or avexcel.com. And you can find us each and every week at twit.tv/TWiCH. That's Twitch. And at that website, you can find all the information on how to subscribe, our older episodes, links, and all sorts of good stuff like that. Oh, exciting stuff. I'm really curious to see some more of the processors, especially from AMD, come out this summer. And I will say I'm not returning my GTX 1070 because it's just that much faster than my 1050 Ti. Right. And I'm circling. Now that I finally have a fast enough GPU, I'm finally circling the idea of buying a VR headset. So
very cool.
If anybody from HTC or Oculus wants to release a significantly reduced, wants to out of nowhere release a headset that is significantly less expensive but delivers the same performance as the current products, I'm all for that. Keep us in mind for a review on that one. Not going to happen, but I can tell you on that one. So that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Patrick Morton.
I'm Ryan Shrout.
We'll see you next week on Twitch.